All right. Hi, everyone. Who's just giving people a couple of extra seconds to get logged on. So thanks for joining me tonight to talk about a really interesting topic. We're going to talk about COVID-19 languishing and why this is important, how it affects us, and what we can do to help ourselves. So I'm Dr. Sandra Bugnano. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work for Homewood Health, and I'm the vice president of our employee and family assistance programs and counseling services. So take some time to get comfortable. If you need to get anything, a glass of water or something, go ahead and do that. I'll have some time at the end. I'm thinking about 15-20 minutes for us to ask some questions. If you have any, you can write them in the question and answer section, and we can get to those towards the end. In terms of an overview, just some things that I think are important here. We'll talk about mental health, mental illness and mental health and everything in between. So really looking at what is mental illness and what leads to those types of issues for us, how COVID-19 has really impacted our well-being, our mental health, our recent experiences with this, what we know. And then what is languishing? You maybe have heard about that. You maybe saw an article that was written recently about it. So we're going to talk a bit about that, and then looking at how we can help ourselves, what we can do about that, how we can cope. So some strategies around that. All right, so this section, we're going to look a little bit about mental illness and a broad definition. This one comes from Health Canada, and it's very straightforward. So we're looking at when our ability to function has been impacted, really, and this can be because of distress that we're experiencing, so changes in our mood, our thinking, and our behavior. And often what we see is this can be accompanied by feelings of isolation, loneliness, sadness, feelings of disconnection from other people. And so to summarize, to bring all of that together, so we see distress, so significant distress that can change our mood, so how we feel, our emotions. We can feel sad, anxious, down, the way we start to think, so our thought processes, what we tell ourselves, how we tend to speak to ourselves, our self-talk, and then how we behave. And so that can be that we may isolate ourselves from others, we may avoid certain things. And so all of this creates sort of that reduced connection to others and difficulty in our functioning. So what we look at in psychology is we really look at, is this causing significant distress and impairment? So those are two just important points about that. And although there are various categories, two common categories of mental illnesses are mood and anxiety disorders. So we do see where we hear currently a lot about depression. We can talk about bipolar disorder. And then in terms of anxiety disorders, we commonly see a lot of panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. And so panic disorder is really when we experience panic attacks and then fear of experiencing those panic attacks again. And so that can affect how we behave and how we start to function. And the panic attack is really when we have a discrete moment of sort of a built up of stress, panic about something that might be happening that we think might happen, and accompanied by different physical sensations like shortness of breath or tightening in our chest, sweating, heart palpitations, dizziness. And it's really a discrete period of time where the symptoms sort of peak, and within 5 to 10 minutes, then we start to feel okay again. And then generalized anxiety is really that presence of persistent worries and sort of those what if scenarios. What if this happens? What if we go back to work? What if it's awkward? What if I don't remember how to socialize with people properly? What if I am unsuccessful? And sort of those anxious apprehensions about what may happen. And so when these issues become more chronic and cause, like what we're saying, distress or impairment. Oh, I'm not on mute. Sorry, somebody just made a comment saying that I'm on mute. I'm not sure. Okay, I hope you can hear me. I can hear you. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So you can hear me. That's wonderful news. All right. Okay, perfect. Thanks, guys. So we were talking about generalized anxiety. So the presence of those persistent kind of worries and can be accompanied by certain physical sensations also. And anyway, and we were saying when it causes distress and impairment, then we can look to seeing that whether it's become an issue for somebody. So briefly, I really want to point out here that the pandemic, that COVID-19 has really had a significant impact on our well-being, which isn't surprising, as I'm sure everybody on this call can attest to. If you just take a second to think about your own well-being over the last 15 months or however long it's been at this point, take a second to think about how the pandemic, how COVID-19 has impacted you, and if you've noticed any changes in your well-being because of that, and how it may have affected you. I think it's important to bring awareness that it's really very common across the world, and we're going to look at just some Canadian data quickly. And so just to build our own awareness of how has this impacted me? How are things different? How did I used to cope? How can I cope now? What's changed? So the greater amount of insight we have into any kind of emotions and thoughts and experiences that we have, the more we can support ourselves in managing and working through any difficulties that could come up. So what we tend to see is an increase in anxiety, and that makes sense. That's really related to the uncertainty, the unknown. What's going to happen, right? And this constant changing information, and then this need to adapt. When we seem to sort of understand one thing one way, we would often get new information and then have to adapt again. And so anytime there's uncertainty, we tend to, and it's very normal, everybody does this, we fill in the gaps, and we fill in, we create a story to make sense of things. And often we tend to create stories that, well, are, can be stressful and not always so reassuring. So what we say to ourselves has an important impact. And when there's uncertainty, we have to pay attention to how we're filling in the gaps, because we want certainty. We want to have some, make sense of things. Human beings always try to make sense of things, and try to find meaning in things. So in the absence of information, it's important to think about us. How do you fill the gaps? What do you tell yourself, and then what impact does that have? And depression is something that we've seen in an increase in suicidal thoughts as well, and doesn't mean it's an increase in suicidality, but in people thinking about suicide, so having those kinds of ideations, thoughts. And it makes sense too for depression, because when there's loss, when there's perceived loss, when there's actual loss, that can be associated with depressive type of symptoms and actual depression. So we've experienced loss of in many different ways, of our routines, of our relationships, in our lives, financially, loss of life. And so in the midst of all of this, these reactions make a lot of sense. And then so we see some coping behavior. So when we start to feel anxious, when we start to feel depressed, that's when we can look to using different substances like alcohol, like cannabis, to manage some of those emotions. So people will find different ways to cope, and those are two that have come up currently. They're not the only ones. There's a whole plethora of different ways that people use, to cope, and some of the behaviors can be more damaging than others. But this is some of what we've seen in some Canadian data. And so these are just some stats that really speak to these issues. If we look at anxiety, we've seen an increase in about 20%, which is quite significant. And in depression, we can see that's more than doubled as well, which is significant as well. And then we talked about binge drinking and cannabis use, and then the suicidal thoughts as well. And again, I just want to underline, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an increase in suicidality or suicidal behavior, but it's very important to note that that there is that increase. And if people do have suicidal thoughts, that we take that very seriously, that we are able to refer them to resources, we're able to refer them to appropriate supports. And there's a service also that exists for all Canadians, Wellness Together Canada, that's free, and that can be accessed online or through a toll-free number to get access and support as well. So in this part here, I just want to talk a bit about mental health, because a lot of people think, well, mental health, well, it just means I'm not maybe mentally unwell. So underlining or highlighting here that the absence of mental illness does not equate to mental wellness, right? So we want to take that a step further. And so very, very simply, I like this type of definition, that it can be defined as the experience of positive feelings and functioning. So the opposite of what we saw for mental illness. And then if we look at sort of other elements that are included in that, what does that mean? What are the dimensions of wellness, right? So there are many different dimensions, and it can be our emotional health, how we're feeling, right? Socially, how our relationships with others, how we connect and behave with others, spiritually, our connection to something greater than ourselves, our environment, occupationally, or occupational dimension of our work, our profession, whatever our occupational role might be, intellectually, or intellectual and physical as well, physical health, intellectual well-being in there. So just some things to think about if you reflect on your own experiences and how you're doing in those different dimensions. If we take a second and we just think, like, how am I doing emotionally? How am I doing in my relationships with others, spiritually, in my space, in my occupational role, intellectually, physically. So we might notice that some of them are not always balanced or at the same level, and that happens in life too. We experience times where some of those dimensions are more fulfilling, or we're doing better in certain areas than others, right? So it's not always balanced. There are ups and downs in different areas. I think it's important to think of where we're at. And maybe even how the pandemic has sort of, or how COVID-19 has sort of affected these different dimensions of well-being, to take note of that and see how that's evolved. And that can give us clues into what we need to focus on and what might be helpful. So just looking at a broad definition again, going back to, did I skip? No, I did not. Okay. Looking at well-being. So if we look at the World Health Organization, because that's a good kind of broad definition. So they talk about us realizing, an individual realizing their own potential. In addition to that, being able to cope with stresses, being productive, right? Working in a productive way, in a fruitful way, making contributions. So they take it a step further. It's not just that well-being in terms of how we're feeling and functioning in those dimensions, but what are we doing with that? Can we cope with stress? So can we adapt? And then how are we productive, and how do we make contributions in life too? So So I like that because it really includes sort of all the elements of what being well is. And I think what I want to sort of highlight in this is our ability to cope is really very important, and to adapt. And if we've learned anything over the last year and a half or so, it really is that that need to adapt. Were we able to adapt? Were we able to be resilient? And how did we do that? And so that's so important, is really being able to work on our ability to adapt, and to manage different stressors that come up, because they always do. It's part of life. So just, I wanted to bring that all together. So we're talking about mental health is really a state of well-being, and then that determines how we function, how we manage stress, adversity, and then how we contribute to society. And I really do like the definition of mental health or well-being as flourishing. And so some authors, Dr. Martin Seligman, define flourishing really as building and maintaining positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And another definition that really captures that is flourishing as the product of the pursuit of engagement. So again, we're talking about engaging in life in a meaningful, authentic way, in a way that brings joy, that can bring joy and happiness through meeting goals, which is important, being connected with life, with our passions, and really relishing in accomplishments through the peaks and valleys. So again, really talking about nothing being perfect, and there always being ups and downs, and how we manage that and continue to live happy and productive lives. So this is what I was really wanting to get to. So talking a little bit about mental illness, a bit about mental health, and then what lies in between that. And so this is an interesting area where researchers in this particular area characterize the absence of mental health, or the absence of flourishing, really as languishing. And so the sociologist, who is a researcher as well, Corey Keyes, he coined this term, languishing, and defined it as really an emptiness, stagnation, constituting a life of quiet despair that parallels accounts of individuals who describe themselves really as hollow, empty, shell, void. So if you take a second to just sort of check in with yourself, how you react to hearing that kind of definition or information. For myself, I feel sad when I read that. It seems like quite an unpleasant state of feeling just empty and being stagnating, not really feeling like you're going anywhere in life. And so that's why it's an important concept. And some symptoms that we do see that accompany the sense of languishing. So we can see a lack of motivation, apathy, sort of a numbness, disinterest in life, and or things that we typically used to like, and that emptiness, restlessness. And some examples that I heard that I really liked, that I thought captured it well during perceptions of life during the pandemic. So someone had said, climbing a never-ending ladder, or like going up a never-ending flight of stairs, listening to a song on repeat. Or that sort of wake up, work, pay bills, sleep, repeat, right? So there's really that sense of stagnation and mundane perception of reality, that there isn't much, there isn't anything that's very interesting in there. So again, if you take a second to think about what your own experience has been. Maybe you've had some moments of languishing. Maybe you've been in a state of languishing for quite some time. In the article that was published by Adam Grant, when he originally was talking about this in the New York Post, he had said, you know, maybe if you've been experiencing this and you haven't been able to put your finger on what it was, and in reading about it, you know, realizing, oh, this might be sort of what's been going on. So you take a second just to think about, reflect about that, if you've been experiencing any of these kinds of emotions, or if the pandemic has had that effect on you. It's something, there's a name for it, and it is that state in between, sort of, well, I'm not unwell, but I'm not flourishing, right? I'm not really engaged and achieving goals and experiencing life the way I want to, in a productive and meaningful way. So, I mean, it might already be apparent why it's important, but just some of the data around it is that we really do see that languishing can lead to psychosocial impairment. So in how we feel, in our relationships with others, so our emotional health, and it can also lead to depression. So some of the data there shows that the impairment levels are comparable to people who experience a depressive episode. So impairment, and like we can look at different spheres of people's lives, impairment in our emotional well-being, in our occupational, professional well-being, our social roles, how we are as a parent, how we are as a partner, how we are as a sister, or as a child, or whatever our social roles are, our ability to function in terms of our professional lives or our academic lives. So the impairment is really important in there. And it's languishing, when we look at some of the research, when there's a measure for it, when you ask different questions, and then you can assess who's languishing, who's flourishing. And when they administer this questionnaire, you can see that it can often be as prevalent as an actual major depressive episode. So it's quite prevalent, and it can limit us in many different ways. And well, this point, there's another point that speaks to lost days of work as well, which speaks to our occupational functioning. There's some newer evidence that was linking languishing to other mental health issues in certain healthcare workers, for instance. It's been linked to post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So it's an important enough state, I think, there that merits attention to understand what it is, to understand if we've been experiencing that, and then what we might need to sort of help ourselves along. So we might be wondering what leads to languishing, or maybe you've already kind of pieced that together through what I was speaking about when I was speaking about the pandemic and the effects on our mental health. So we've experienced a prolonged state of stress. So stress is really when we react to anything that sort of exceeds our resources, it can place a demand on our resources. It's anything that we think maybe that is difficult to handle or to cope, or is unknown. And so then there's that constant change that I mentioned before, change in information, in what we knew even about the virus, and how it behaved in terms of so different health information, in terms of public safety, things being closed, things being open. It's a lot to process, right? And so if we're in a state where we're constantly receiving sort of new information, well, our brains are in a state of alert. And so that in itself can lead to anxiety, and it's tiring after a while. And then we talked a little bit about so the need to adapt, obviously, to those changes, and adapt in our routines. Kids being schooled from home, going to school physically, coming back, working from home, maybe returning to the workplace, lots to process. And then, of course, the uncertainty of what's going to happen from the very beginning. what was going to happen with the virus, vaccines, now maybe return to work, different things like that. And what I didn't mention, which is important before, a lack of control. Anytime we have an experience of a lack of control, it leads to, usually for a lot of people, stress. We like to have a certain amount of control and predictability. People don't like unpredictability and lack of control. Typically, that's harder to navigate. There are people who are less reactive to this and more resilient, so to speak, to sort of rolling with changes and adapting. And but it's hard to not have control and to live in uncertainty and a prolonged state of stress. And then that prolonged state of vigilance, what I mean is when, if you're out and about, you're always thinking of, okay, did I touch something? Do I need to sanitize my hands? Is my mask on properly? Am I too close to somebody? Did that person just sneeze or cough? Or so your brain, again, is being solicited to constantly process a lot of information. And so it's hard to pay attention, to concentrate, to make sense of things when we're in a state of stress, prolonged stress or anxiety. That part of our brain that would usually work to help us analyze and make sense of things is not able to do so because of that state of stress and how it's impacting us. And so I think these are different things that are related to why we started to, or why we may be languishing. And it really makes a lot of sense. And I don't know if it's, I hope it might be helpful to put a name to maybe some, put a name to something that you may be feeling. So I think it's important to be able to identify that, normalize it. It makes sense. We know why, or we have ideas of why that would happen. And then what do we do with this? So in this section, I want to just look at some things that might be helpful. How can we overcome languishing? How can we help ourselves through experiencing this kind of state that's rather unpleasant? So one thing that you maybe have heard of is behavioral activation. And in psychology, psychologists or counselors as well, we often will recommend behavioral activation for depression. And it can help with people's motivation and counter apathy, and usually that we see in depression. So really we look at setting goals and then becoming active in different areas of our lives. And that could be whether we can have goals that involve like our physical well-being, we can have goals that involve our social well-being, connecting with others, being active, taking care of ourselves. So we can have goals in different areas, but what's important is to identify some small steps and then see how we can put them into action. It can be really small things. If you've been stuck inside, just being able to get outside maybe once a day for 15 minutes, and then maybe it's 30 minutes. Or if you've been really disconnected from people, maybe it's making a connection to chat with somebody on the phone, or to text or email or message to somebody once a week. And then, if that goal is accomplished and makes sense, maybe then you try to do that 2 times a week or 3 times a week. So it's looking at how we can become active in different areas and achieve certain goals. And so we really want to look at adding some kind of value to our lives through this. So this is one thing, and it can be quite powerful and it can be quite effective. And there are a lot of different resources. If you just look that up, behavioral activation, that will resources are available that will show you a calendar and give you suggestions. And so there's all kinds of stuff out there, but it may not really be enough to just do that for languishing. So what we think probably is more helpful in engaging in behavioral activation is really challenging ourselves to try new things, to learn new things, and engaging in activities in that way that leads us to think in different ways. And so it might sound complicated, but it's not. I just put a couple of examples, like if we're not an outdoors person, trying an outdoor activity. If we only speak one language, learning maybe not a whole other language, maybe words in a different language. If we're not particularly artistic or musical, or maybe we learn to sing or to play an instrument, or anything basically that's out of your zone of comfort, learning to dance, whatever it might be that can challenge your brain to thinking differently. And that kind of can get the cobwebs out of our brains, so to speak. It's something that's recommended also when we age, to keep our brains in good shape. Is we want to challenge them, and we challenge them by doing things that we're not good at, basically, or that we're not used to doing. Because when we're used to doing something like driving a car, do you ever really think about what you're doing? Like, okay, putting the keys in, starting the engine, I don't know, my foot is on the gas. Like, you don't think about it anymore. It's so automatic. So it's not very challenging for our brains. So we want to be able to learn different things, do things differently. And then what we see is more energy and motivation can result from that kind of activity. We could feel proud of accomplishments and what we've done, and in turn we experience more positive emotions. We feel good, we may feel happier, and we also know that these things can be associated with those feel good neurotransmitters in our brains, that are in the brain, that actually lead to more positive emotions. So really, if we could just try even to do one thing that's out of our comfort zone and stick with it enough to sort of see if we can break through some of that. A really simple example, of just doing something differently could be even things around the house. If you're not, I don't know, if you're not typically the one that sort of organizes different spaces and declutters, maybe that could be something that you could take on as a challenge. And I think if I reflect just personally about it, I was on a maternity leave. I had a baby a few months ago, and it really did challenge me to do things out of my comfort zone, like singing, for instance, or playing music, or being really, silly to engage with the baby. And I really think that had a very positive effect, to just behave in a way that was so different, and kind of have to stick with it. So if there's a takeaway there, I would say that's something that can be really helpful. Then there's certain points regarding self-care that are really important. So what we say to ourselves, our internal dialogue, our self-talk, is really very important. And it's so powerful. If you think for a second, if I ask you to think about something that you don't like about yourself, likely you all have an answer very quickly. Versus if I ask you to, think about something that you really like about yourself, maybe some of you thought of something really quickly, maybe it took you a little bit longer. But so what we see is it's easier for people to think often about negative traits that they have, and to recall that information. And then what happens over time is we condition our brain to think in that way. And so we reinforce those patterns of thinking, and so they become more prevalent. And so we really, if we do the opposite and we reinforce a more kind of neutral or positive, favorable way of thinking, over time, that will become more easily accessible. So we have to pay attention to how we think about ourselves. oh, I'm actually going to get into all these points, so I should stop talking about them. But so nurturing our bodies, the way we take care of ourselves, our spirit, our social, our support network, and our relationships. So sorry, I was going to get into these. So I guess that was a good interlude to how our thinking can really affect us, and how we create connections. If we're focused on, negative or unpleasant things, we're going to recall them more quickly. They're going to be more easily accessible. And then that can lead to feeling depressed, down, stressed. So one way that we can help ourselves is to really create some distance, is a good way to describe it. So, if we're experiencing a difficult kind of state, we're having a reaction, just stop, observe, describe, what's happening, what am I thinking, what am I telling myself, how is that making me feel, how is that making me behave, is that helpful? If it's not, well, what's another way that I might want to think about this? What can I do to help myself? What would I do to help somebody else that might be thinking like this? Or what would I do to help someone I care about, my best friend who's thinking like this? What would I say? And the second point is really being curious about our thoughts. So not taking them as facts, not thinking that they're total truths all the time, because we can think and tell ourselves really scary things and awful things. And it doesn't mean that they're right. It doesn't mean that it's true. If we're thinking, I don't know, if a work example, I'll never be able to complete whatever project for the deadline. Like I'm doomed. Like, forget it. I'm never going to make it. Well, we're going to feel really stressed. And if we assume that that's true, we're going to set ourselves up for potentially for failure or a lot of stress. So we're able then in that moment to just stop and say, well, that's a thought. Like, that doesn't mean that this is what's going to happen. It doesn't mean that this is true. So I'm just thinking that. So kind of not what we call it in a type of therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, is to diffuse from the thought. So you're not the thought, and the thought is not the truth, it's a thought, right? Like an emotion is emotion, it's passing, it comes, it affects us, it leaves. The thought, is in our mind, and that's it. It's up to us to decide how we want to interact with that, if that makes sense. So about our bodies, we always hear things like be active and sleep and eat well. But in reality, what we know and what we need to consider is, if we're physically active, we're going to maintain our good state of mental well-being, in terms of anxiety, in terms of our our mood, our happiness. And what we know is people who have been depressed, being physically active is probably the only thing that will maintain a state of well-being once you've recovered from depression. We know that that's one thing that people can do to stay well and help their moods. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like, I don't know, CrossFit or some kind of intense training, which is fine if that's what you like to do, but you can think at like, okay, well, what's the first step? Maybe it's just walking a few times a week, or anything that gets my, my heartbeat up. How can I be active? How does it make sense in my life, right? In the pandemic, finding creative ways. I think maybe people have seen that online, people making obstacle courses in their houses and running up and down the stairs and, doing all these things. Well, in a way that makes sense for you, can be helpful. And sleep, of course, we need enough sleep. Most people need about 7 or even 8 hours of sleep a night. And what we see is, when you're actually in a state of sleep deprivation, when you just haven't slept enough, cognitively, it's actually worse than being drunk. People's performance is more impaired than people who are intoxicated. So we really do need to sleep. We need that to really be able to recuperate, recover. And that also helps with our mental state, our well-being. And of course, what we eat I mean, seems obvious, but is really important. But some of us maybe are, not taking breaks to eat lunch, or aren't drinking enough water, or aren't eating good quality food, and that will really affect our physical state, but also our mental state. And then things too, like maybe we don't notice how much caffeine we're drinking, and then we finished like 6 or 7 cups already. So just some things to consider in there. And these are some things that I personally really think are fantastic. So really being mindful is a particular way to pay attention. So really being in the moment, and really focusing on what's happening in the moment in the non-judgmental way and in an effective way, sort of that makes sense for you. What I mean by that is, if okay, so we can give a very simple example of just eating mindfully, like of eating an apple or some kind of fruit really mindfully, paying attention to what it is that you're eating, how you're eating it, the sensation of it. It could be paying attention to birds that you're hearing outside, really being connected to whatever it is that you are paying attention to in the present moment. So really observing, describing, and sitting with things as they are. So not letting your mind necessarily wander, not I don't know, doing the dishes and thinking of 10 other things, but doing the dishes, looking at the bubbles, looking at the dishes. It's sitting and paying attention to the present moment in a particular way. And then something that we often see sort of related to that is meditation. And meditation, if you haven't tried, there's so many good apps and different things online that you can access to try it out, see if you like it. And even just meditating 2 minutes a day is actually really helpful and can help us manage our stress level. So if you want to try anything related to meditation, mindfulness, gratitude, and that's really being thankful for things that we're appreciative of in our lives. And it can be really simple, like just noticing one thing that we're grateful for a day, or we could keep a journal, whatever makes sense to you. Some people like to write down a few things. Some people find that kind of cumbersome, or I don't know, more difficult. So even just thinking of one thing, or sharing, it could be even sharing one thing with your partner. And that again is really related to sort of what we're thinking of, we reinforce. And if we're thinking of things that we're grateful for, we're also focusing on what's going well and being appreciative, and that leads to more positive emotions as well. Self-compassion is so important. The author listed there, Kristen Neff, has published some really good work around this, and it's really about how we treat ourselves, how we talk to ourselves, being kind to ourselves, recognizing that, well, everybody suffers through difficult times. Everybody has to deal with that, and talking to ourselves as we would somebody that we love, as a friend, being kind and not being critical. We really, what we see with self-compassion is that it's very helpful, and even sort of more important than things like self-esteem, because self-esteem varies. When we tend to be, when we're doing well, we're successful, our self-esteem, could be higher. And then when things aren't going as well, our self-esteem can be impacted. But self-compassion is something that we can use anytime to help ourselves through difficult situations. And it actually helps us to perform better when we're kinder to ourselves and less judgmental. And we help ourselves in that way. And so we know that daily practices, even if it's very simple and small things, really, really does increase our ability to cope, or our coping skills and our ability to cope with stress and difficult circumstances. And so if there's anything on there that sounds interesting, I think some of you are already doing it, because I see some stuff popping up in the chat box about gratitude and different things like that. So if you're already practicing some of it, great. If there's something you want to try, there are so many resources and great books and things. So I would encourage you to look at that. And of course, building our support network, staying connected is a great way to manage stress and consult with people and see what their perspective is. And it can be, we have our family, friends, it could be neighbors, co-workers, whatever makes sense to you, and leveraging technology to stay in touch with people. And just that last point, I think, different people are sort of good, or different relationships are good for different things. Like there's some people we can rely on and trust for emotional support, but not everybody. There's some people that are really good when we need some practical advice or help with something. Like we know who to go to get a different perspective, to get some, to just vent or share something. So yeah, I'd encourage you to think of who those people are, because it's perfectly fine and normal that we don't go necessarily to the same person for everything. So just identifying sort of who those supports are and who the people are that we can count on for our different needs. And of course, some sort of creative ways of trying to stay in touch and do different things during the pandemic. So some people really like doing virtual game nights. That's been popular on different apps. If that's something that you like, that could be something to look at, trying a recipe and then eating together virtually. You can go back to pen pals or writing letters and different things like that. So just consider, I would say, ways that make sense for you, that seem helpful for you. And of course, we can't forget to laugh because it really does have a positive effect on us. In looking at who we can have sort of intellectual connections with, or meeting in person, but being physically distanced as well. So just encouraging you to think of different ways that you can help yourselves stay connected in ways that you are meaningful and make sense to you, because no one can tell us how to do this. We know what we're comfortable with, and what we like. So just some things in terms of self-care to think of. Consistency is really important. When we try something, we want to keep with it and then see sort of, is it helping me? What kind of effect has it had on me? Planning ahead to sort of see, okay, what do I need to do to maintain this, or what are certain roadblocks or barriers that would come up? And the part about being kind, self-compassion. We just give ourselves some grace. It's been a tough time, but even if it wasn't, we should still be really kind to ourselves. To keep that in mind. And there's some contact information for us as well for Homewood Health. And then I have some resources listed that we can share. So we do have some time. I did want to see if you guys, I saw a lot of stuff pop up in the chat. I was wondering if you guys had any questions. I would say maybe to, probably to type them in here, because I see a lot of stuff that I could kind of go over. But if you have any specific questions, you could type them. Oh, there's more down here. Okay. All right. Okay, so is it normal for some of the impacts of COVID? Is it normal for some of the impacts of COVID that they're good? I've had less migraines, back and neck disorders, and enjoyed working from home instead of the office. I feel more accomplished. If that makes sense. I miss people and personal socialization, but I'm enjoying, for the most part, some of the changes. Yeah, I think some people really do enjoy a lot of the changes, like working from home, spending maybe more time with family. Maybe, you know, there's certain stressors that aren't there that, you know, help with different things like back pain and certain things like that. I think it's had a different kind of impact on different people. People who are more introverted may be happier to spend less time around people, and that's really okay. So I think it really does depend on your needs and sort of your situation. Maybe you were somebody who lives really far from work and you don't have to commute anymore, and that in itself has been really helpful. Oh wow, okay, I'm not I will start at the end. Okay, what advice do you have as things get back to normal? I find change very stressful. Yeah, I mean, definitely, again, that really points to that idea of the constant change and constant need to adapt, and that being really stressful. I would say really getting as much information as you can ahead of time to sort of socialize different ideas with yourself. Like if you know you're going back to your workplace, get information about sort of what the workspace looks like, what the public health policies are around that, you know, mask wearing, physical distancing, hand sanitizing, sort of what the lunchroom looks like, sort of all of that information. The more information that you have about what you're, you know, the back to normal, what that looks like, the more you're going to be able to sort of walk yourself through it, imagine yourself in that situation, make sense of it, see, you know, what you need to support yourself. So it is very stressful and there's so much back and forth and everything. So we need to find ways to make sense of it and identify really what's going to happen so we can support ourselves through it. Is it normal to have a lot of behavioral change, amount of cleanup in the house, self-care, and care about appearance? Behavioral change? It's normal to have a lot of a lot of behaviors change. Yeah, I mean, I think I know what you mean by that. Because I think because our environments are so different, so we may clean the house less or more. We may care less about what we look like if we're not around people, or maybe, you know, more in certain circumstances for meetings and things. And I think maybe what's important is there to see if you are well with those changes. Do they cause distress? Are they causing issues in how you're functioning in your relationships with others? So I would pay attention to that. That could be a helpful sort of guide. Trying to look for questions. Here, okay. Often feel guilty for feeling this way because where I live, we've not been in lockdown more than once last year. Is still feeling this languishing and could not understand why I feel this way and could not put my finger on it, and keep hearing how lucky I am and how worse people are. So I don't want to talk about it. Yeah, that's tough. Like, you're entitled to how you're feeling and you're entitled to how you view your situation, and it being, you know, upsetting, distressing, whatever it is, even if people may, you know, have different circumstances, you're entitled to what you're feeling. You're not, you know, wrong or anything that you might, any way you might be judging yourself. You're entitled to what you're feeling, and it's hard. We should try not to compare ourselves to others, because, you know, our circumstances affect us in a certain way and they maybe wouldn't affect somebody else in that way. So it doesn't mean because there's more lockdown somewhere else or people are more limited that you should be doing better, because, you know, everybody has faced certain issues around losses and uncertainty and change. And so I would just remind yourself you're entitled to what you're feeling. And yeah, telling people that they're lucky, yeah, it's not, you know, it's not necessarily the most supportive thing to say. How do we convince a family member to get help who has been languishing for quite some time now? Yeah, self-deprecating is constant and painful for those who love them. Trying to convince them to adapt these steps towards a joyful life is not working. There is no joy for them. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely tough. It's hard when people don't want to seek help and others around them see that they would benefit from it. I don't think we can convince people. I think we can ask them questions, maybe. So, we can say to them, are you, in your words, are you well with the way your life is now? Are you happy? Or in whatever way, and sort of see like if they say yes or if they say no. If they say no, you can ask them like, well, what do you think would help you be happier? And the point of asking questions like that is really just helping somebody to get to the conclusion themselves that they may need some help or support. Because if we tell them to do it, a lot of people will kind of have a counter reaction and will on purpose not do it. So sort of just asking questions and being supportive to see if they can come to certain conclusions on their own, I think can be helpful. Okay, I have been thinking about that a lot lately. For me, I'm asking myself what it is that I want to return to. There were many good things that have been temporarily set aside. I'm also giving myself permission not to pick up everything that was set aside, and I'm asking what new things I want to bring into my life. Yeah, wow, that's a great reflection. Sorry, I didn't finish the sentence. What new things I want to bring into my life post-pandemic? And so I think looking at sort of positive things that this has maybe taught us is that there were potentially things that we weren't happy with in terms of our routines or our lives. And some of what I've heard too centers around not spending enough time with family, not seeing, whatever it is, kids enough or different things like that. And really realizing like, I want to spend more time with family, or I don't want to work as much, or some people have started to have more time to exercise and things like that, and they want to maintain that. So I think that's a really good reflection, looking at maybe also things that you may have gained throughout this time, or come to better understand about yourselves that you want to maintain. Yeah. Someone just, sorry, that made a comment about the pandemic, like others will pass. Absolutely. Okay, I live at home with elderly parents who both have pessimistic looks on life. Feel like I'm being pulled down by them. They are demanding in terms of health, needing to be stimulated, and they're relying on me, and I can't seem to get myself settled. Every time I have me time, they interrupt. How do I get back into mental wellness without hurting them? Oh yeah, I think a lot of people are in different situations like this, and it's really hard when we're the only caregiver. So I would ask, are you the only caregiver to them? Do you have any other supports? Are there any systems around you in healthcare that offer support as well? And if not, I think really looking at what is what you need in terms of me time, and when there aren't things that are urgent, how you can make that time and still balance with what they need, but setting those appropriate kind of boundaries if they don't have a need and it's sort of being overly demanding, that you're able to set that boundary and get some time back for yourself. They're hard circumstances, especially when we're around people that are pessimistic like that. It's I will often say, kind of play the devil's advocate and say the opposite. If they say something really negative, I might find the positive in it and say, oh, well, did you ever think of, like how horrible we're not going out and we can't do all these things? Well, I'm happy that we get to spend so much time together, or kind of trying to see the other side of it and using some humor sometimes, I think, if we can help. I think I'll just try to answer one more. Can you talk about being entitled to your feelings? I get a lot of messaging from colleagues that we're lucky to be working. I feel the flip side of this is that at the expense of others that may have lost their work. Yeah, I mean, it definitely is difficult when we're sort of comparing ourselves again to other people's realities. And, you know, we can't compare ourselves to others. So I don't think that, you know, in this instance, like somebody working is at the expense of other people having necessarily lost work. I think it's important to focus on ourselves in terms of sort of our experience and what we're feeling and what our reality is. If we are working, you know, and we do feel well about that, then I would not compare myself to others. I would focus on my situation and, you know, my current state. And if I don't feel well about my work or I don't like working, well, I'm also entitled to that feeling. All I mean by that is, you know, no one can tell you or should tell you what you should be feeling. You're allowed to react in a certain way and feel the way you do, and there's no right way to act, that, you know, you should be happy or you should feel lucky. No, whatever you're feeling is fine and makes sense. And then it's up to you to sort of make sense of it and say, well, okay, do I, you know, does it make sense how I'm thinking, and do I want to feel this way, or do I want to try to understand, you know, what this is related to and how I can help myself feel differently. Okay, so I think there are a lot more questions in the chat. I believe we can make certain things available for the presentation. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time and for participating as well, asking some questions. I hope you got at least a couple of things from this to either further explore or hang on to. And so looking forward to better times that we have ahead, and thank you and have a good evening.